The first time the offshore relay answered in my own voice. I was standing alone in the communications room, watching condensation slide down the inside of the reinforced window. I remember checking the timestamp twice, because the response arrived before I finished speaking, as if it already knew what I would say. I had been warned during orientation that there were 11 strange rules tied to this position, but they were presented like corporate superstition, not survival instructions. I laughed about them for weeks, right up until the night I broke one without realizing it. The reply is still playing in my headset, waiting for me to finish a sentence I don't remember starting. I didn't learn that sentence from a handbook or a laminated card, but from a man who refused to sit down while he told me, pacing the narrow room as if the walls were listening. He said it exactly once, calm but deliberate, and I remember thinking how strange it was that Rule 1, never respond to a transmission that addresses you by name, sounded more like advice than policy. I nodded like I understood, even joked that half the job was answering people who didn't know who they were calling. He didn't smile back, just watched my mouth like he was memorizing it. When he finally left, the door sealed slower than usual, and I was alone with equipment that suddenly felt less obedient. The communications room sat lower than most of the rig, wrapped in steel and insulation meant to keep pressure and interference out. From that depth, you didn't see the ocean directly, but you felt it, a constant reminder that the water was stacked miles high and patient. I spent my first hours learning the rhythm of the place, checking relay paths, logging delays, and listening to empty channels breathe with static absence. Every message passed through me, and I passed it along, invisible and necessary. It was comforting work, until I noticed how often people used names when they shouldn't have known them. Names weren't standard protocol out here, not over open channels, not with rotating crews and layered security. Most transmissions were clipped, professional, stripped of personality to avoid confusion or mistakes. When someone broke that habit, it stood out sharply, like a fingerprint on glass. I flagged a few early on, sent them up the chain, and got bland acknowledgments in return. No one explained why, and no one corrected the behavior. On my third night shift, fatigue settled behind my eyes like a bruise, and the room felt smaller than before. I was halfway through a routine signal test when a transmission cut in, clean and direct, bypassing the usual handshake. It used my full name, first and last, pronounced carefully, like it was reading it off a screen inches away. For a moment my body reacted before my thoughts did, fingers hovering over the response switch out of pure habit. I told myself it was a mistake, someone misrouted, something I could clear up quickly. I didn't answer right away, and the silence stretched in an uncomfortable way, not empty but expectant. The message repeated, slower this time, still using my name, still waiting like it knew I was there. I checked the source ID, but it didn't map to any rig, vessel or satellite path we used. My training told me to escalate unknown signals, but my instincts urged me to resolve it myself, to prove I could handle irregularities. That was the first crack, the moment authority stopped feeling reliable. I keyed an internal line instead, and called the shift supervisor, keeping my voice steady as I explained what I was seeing. He asked me to repeat the source identifier twice, then went quiet longer than necessary. When he spoke again, he didn't give instructions, just asked if the transmission had said anything else. I told him no, only my name, and there was a pause where I imagined him weighing how much truth I was allowed to hear. He finally said to log it and disconnect the channel, as if that was something you could do cleanly. Disconnecting didn't stop the signal, it just changed how it behaved. Instead of coming through the main relay, it appeared as a local echo, like feedback without a source. The room felt warmer, though the temperature readouts didn't move, and the lights seemed a shade dimmer, though they still worked. I realized then that the equipment wasn't malfunctioning, it was cooperating with something else. That thought stayed with me longer than the transmission itself. I tried to distract myself with paperwork, updating logs that no one would read until morning. The words blurred together, and every so often I felt the urge to glance at the console, convinced something had changed. When I finally looked, the channel was open again, despite my earlier action. The message didn't repeat, but the line indicator pulsed gently, like a held breath. I sat back, hands flat on my thighs, and waited for instructions that didn't come. What unsettled me most wasn't fear, but the sense that I had been measured and found interesting. Whoever or whatever had used my name hadn't demanded anything yet, and that restraint felt deliberate. I understood then that my job wasn't just to pass information, but to decide when not to be known. The room no longer felt like a workplace, but a boundary I was standing on without a map. As the indicator pulsed again, slower this time, I realized something had already learned how long I hesitated before responding. I didn't hear this one from a person at all, which should have been my warning, but exhaustion makes bad teachers feel reasonable. The rule was typed into the internal log system, sometime between my last entry and the time I refreshed the screen, labeled cleanly as Rule 2. If the transmission pauses mid-sentence, do not fill the silence, as if it had always been there. I assumed it was a delayed sync from headquarters, some update pushed while I wasn't looking. What unsettled me was that the timestamp predated my hire date by several years. I remember staring at it, waiting for an explanation to arrive the way instructions usually do. I should explain how silence works in a place like this, because it's never empty the way people on land imagine. There's always data passing through, always systems acknowledging each other, small confirmations flowing back and forth to prove everything is still connected. When a transmission pauses mid-sentence, it feels less like quiet and more like restraint, as if something chose to stop instead of failing to continue. That distinction mattered more than I wanted to admit. I told myself the note was metaphorical, a reminder not to interrupt corrupted signals. It was easier than considering any other meaning. The first time I encountered that pause, it came from a routine status check with a support vessel stationed miles away. The operator's voice was familiar, steady, and clearly human, reporting fuel levels and weather conditions without deviation. Halfway through a sentence about heading adjustments, he stopped speaking, not abruptly, but gently, like someone waiting to be prompted. The channel stayed open, the connection strong, nothing indicating a dropout. My training screamed at me to ask for clarification, to confirm receipt, to keep the exchange moving. I didn't respond immediately, and the seconds stretched in a way that made my chest tighten. I watched the waveform hover, flat but present, like a held expression. In that moment, the new rule surfaced in my mind uninvited, and I hated that it already felt familiar. I wondered who had decided this applied to me now, and why it hadn't been mentioned during orientation. The authority behind it felt distant, abstract, and unchallengeable, like a decision made too far away to question. When the operator finally resumed speaking, his tone hadn't changed, but the sentence did. He repeated the same words he had started before, verbatim, as if the pause hadn't happened at all. There was no acknowledgement of the gap, no correction, no embarrassment, just continuation. I logged it as a minor anomaly and moved on, pretending my hands hadn't shaken during the entry. The log system accepted my note without comment, and the rule remained, unedited and unexplained. Later that shift, a different transmission paused in the same way, this time from an automated system that wasn't supposed to pause at all. It recited diagnostics until it reached a familiar threshold, then stopped on a conjunction, waiting. I felt the urge to finish it myself, to supply the expected phrase, to prove I understood how the system worked. My mouth even formed the words silently before I caught myself. The idea that silence could be an invitation felt wrong, but not responding felt worse. I leaned back in my chair and folded my hands together, forcing stillness. The pause dragged on longer than before, long enough for doubt to creep in and suggest the rule might be outdated, irrelevant, a relic of some past incident that no longer applied. I imagined a supervisor reviewing my logs later, asking why I hadn't intervened sooner. Authority, I realized, had trained me to value action over restraint. Whoever wrote these rules seemed to understand that and was working against it. When the system resumed, The diagnostics had changed, referencing parameters I didn't recognize. It spoke as if the pause had been used for something else, something preparatory. I felt a flicker of relief for not having spoken, followed immediately by guilt, as if I had avoided responsibility rather than danger. That emotional confusion lingered, making it harder to trust my instincts. I started to see how obedience could feel like survival, even when the reasoning stayed hidden. As the night wore on, pauses became more frequent, scattered across channels that shouldn't have intersected. Some resumed cleanly, others resumed altered, and a few never resumed at all. I noticed patterns forming that I couldn't fully articulate, and the sense that the rig's systems were responding to something beyond our oversight grew stronger. No announcement came from management, no clarification, no reassurance. The silence between words had become a space I was expected to guard, without being told what I was guarding it from. Near the end of my shift, a transmission came through that I recognized as internal, routed from within the rig itself. It began with routine maintenance chatter, then paused mid-sentence, holding longer than any before it. I stared at the console, aware of my breathing, aware of how easy it would be to speak and end the discomfort. The urge to fill the silence felt almost physical, like pressure behind my eyes. I realized then that the rule wasn't about sound at all, but about permission, and someone was waiting to see if I would give it. I discovered this one the hard way, in the small hours when exhaustion had dulled my judgment, and the rig seemed to lean closer around me. The console flashed, a clean double blink that I almost ignored, thinking it was part of routine diagnostics. But Rule 3, never initiate a transmission when the indicator blinks twice in succession, echoed in my mind anyway. I shrugged off the warning, rationalizing that the system might be testing connectivity or signaling routine maintenance. I keyed the line anyway, fingers hovering a fraction too long before pressing, and the silence that followed felt thicker than any static I'd ever heard. It wasn't the equipment itself that made me uneasy. It was the awareness that something had noticed my choice. The moment the transmission began, I realized my mistake, not immediately, but in the subtle way the rig seemed to shift around me. The hum of machinery, normally monotonous, changed cadence, almost deliberate, as if the walls themselves were breathing in reaction to what I'd done. I could feel tension coiling under my skin, a slow tightening of nerves that didn't dissipate. Nothing appeared on the monitors except the blinking line itself, yet the sense of observation was unmistakable. I had crossed a threshold without knowing where the boundary lay. Every operator knows the ritual of initiation. Wait for the green, confirm the line, check the logs. I followed these steps habitually, trusting their rhythm, trusting the system. But the double blink was different. It was a warning built into the rhythm, not a failure or oversight. I realized too late that the rig communicated in ways beyond our human interface, and my action had triggered a response I couldn't interpret. The lesson wasn't taught in orientation, and the manual never hinted at this subtle pulse of caution embedded in the indicator. As I continued the transmission, words leaving my lips without confidence, I sensed the rig leaning further into the moment, coaxing, testing, assessing. I repeated myself unnecessarily, trying to fill what I imagined was an empty space, a void created by my decision. My own voice sounded strange in the room, resonating against metal and insulation in a way that didn't feel natural. I knew instinctively that the double blink had not just been a signal, it had been a gate, and I had stepped through without permission. Minutes, or what felt like hours, passed though the logs suggested only moments. The words I spoke were accepted, yet I felt their weight heavy and uneven, like I had fed something I shouldn't have. The console remained otherwise unchanged. No error codes, no alerts, just the faint, steady presence of the blinking indicator now at rest. I couldn't tell if it had been watching my behavior, or if my own perception had warped under stress. Either possibility was enough to make my hands tremble, long after I released the key. Later I noticed subtle discrepancies in the transmitted message when reviewed on playback. Phrases had shifted order, numbers adjusted slightly, pauses placed where I had not intended them. I told myself it was an equipment glitch, a timing error, Yet the irregularity seemed intentional, as if my act of initiation had invited interference. The realization unsettled me more than fear alone could. I had participated willingly in something that defied the rig's stated protocols, and I couldn't undo it. Every measure of certainty I held about routine communication felt fragile. I avoided the indicator for the remainder of the shift, treating it with exaggerated caution, as though acknowledging its existence without engaging could absolve me. Yet the memory of the double blink lingered, a quiet echo behind my eyes that made normal blinking patterns, normal signals feel suspect. I began interpreting every light and flash as a potential test, measuring myself against rules I barely understood. The rig's presence became less mechanical and more aware, subtle judgments passing between the circuits and the blinking line. By the end of my rotation, I realized the double blink wasn't merely a cautionary signal, it was an invitation, a measure of obedience, and an assertion of control. I couldn't explain why the system singled me out, nor why I felt accountable beyond reason. The normality of other transmissions made this one stand apart, an isolated act with consequences I could neither see nor describe. Each time I recounted the sequence in my own mind, I sensed a trace of that expectation lingering, like residue that refused to dissipate. When the next shift arrived, I saw someone else glance at the indicator with unease, fingers hovering over the keys. I wanted to warn them, but found my voice caught somewhere between instruction and hesitation. The memory of my own error felt too immediate, and yet too invisible for anyone else to grasp. The rig continued humming, blinking, and observing, indifferent to my panic yet intimately tied to my compliance. I understood that the rule existed not to prevent harm in the usual sense, but to test patience, control impulses, and measure awareness without revealing the stakes. And as I finally sat back, staring at the indicator now dark and still, I realized that I had learned the lesson at the cost of a subtle trust I would never regain. It was impossible to tell if the rig had punished me, corrected me, or merely recorded the event for some distant judgment. The weight of that knowledge was less immediate than fear, but more enduring, a quiet erosion of certainty. The double blink remained in my mind, waiting silently, and I sensed that its memory would always outlast the calm of the empty room. That morning I woke to the rig humming differently, like it had shifted slightly overnight, and my instincts prickled before my eyes even opened. Rule 4. Always log every ambient anomaly before acknowledging any incoming message came back to me. Crisp and authoritative, as if my fingers already remembered the ritual. I glanced at the screens, each feed showing familiar equipment in corridors. Yet something was off. Lights that didn't flicker the way they should. Ventilation fans slowing and speeding inconsistently. I paused, unsure whether to note these discrepancies or call it routine maintenance, and the hesitation weighed heavy in the room. The air seemed to thrum with expectation, as if waiting to see what I would do next. I started scribbling in the digital log, noting every minor shift, the tempo of the rig's internal pumps, the irregular hum of machinery, the faint sway of cables that should have been taut. Each entry took longer than it should have, my hands shaking as I tried to capture something I couldn't fully articulate. The rig felt less like a machine, and more like a living organism responding to my attention. Logging was no longer a mundane task. It was a safeguard, the first line between myself and consequences I didn't yet understand. And even as I typed, I realized that the act of observation itself had become a form of communication. The first transmission of the shift came through, routine on its surface, a report of weather and wave heights from a nearby buoy. Normally I would have answered immediately, but the memory of past mistakes held me in check. I logged everything I could observe in the room before responding. The subtle flicker of the fluorescent lights, the almost imperceptible vibration of the console, the faint scent of ozone that seemed out of place. By the time I pressed the acknowledgement button, my pulse had risen, a quiet reminder that awareness alone could protect or punish. The system accepted my response without comment, but the sense of surveillance lingered like an unshakable shadow. As the hours passed, anomalies multiplied in subtle ways, screens that briefly displayed static patterns resembling faces, cables that seemed to shift when no one was present, the temperature creeping up and down in small increments. I noted each instance, careful to record time, location, and perceived severity. The act of documenting became almost ritualistic, an anchor against the anxiety threatening to dissolve the edges of reason. Each new entry felt heavier, as though the rig itself were watching how diligently I observed. I realized that the rule wasn't about procedure. It was about establishing a record of attentiveness that might have consequences I could not yet see. Mid-shift, a colleague attempted to bypass logging, answering a transmission immediately, without noting the minor hums and shifts I had cataloged. I wanted to intervene, but remembered the unspoken hierarchy. Each person's responsibility ended where the system could measure it. Watching them, I felt a creeping paranoia settle in. Their voice carried smoothly over the line, oblivious to the irregularities, and I wondered if they would notice the consequences of skipping the step. The rig remained unchanged on the surface, but the tension under the metal skin of the communications room was palpable, almost deliberate in its constancy. By afternoon, anomalies had escalated in ways that were difficult to describe, shadows stretching across the corridors that had no source, sensors fluctuating for no apparent reason, and the faint echo of voices when none should exist. I continued to log everything meticulously, my hands cramping, my eyes burning, yet unwilling to skip a single observation. Even the act of writing became a mental test, each note a proof that I had seen, acknowledged, and survived thus far. I started to notice patterns forming between the anomalies, subtle correlations that hinted at awareness beyond my comprehension. During a particularly long pause, I realized that the rig seemed to respond to my documentation in small ways. Monitors would adjust brightness, the hum of machinery would change pitch, even the ventilation would shift slightly. Each anomaly seemed to be testing me, whether I was meticulous, whether I hesitated, whether I respected the act of observation. The rule, simple on paper, had become a form of negotiation, an understanding that my survival depended not just on following instructions, but on proving awareness and patience. I felt myself both empowered and trapped by this realization. Even when the transmissions grew urgent, asking for coordinates, confirmation, or status reports, I maintained the logging first, moving mechanically through each observation before pressing the acknowledgement key. The tension in the room became almost unbearable, and I felt as though the rig itself were breathing along with me, measuring the correctness of my actions. Mistakes seemed magnified, each potential misstep a weight pressing down from unseen angles. I couldn't tell if the anomalies were natural, mechanical, or deliberate, only that the rule required careful, uninterrupted compliance. As the shift drew toward its end, I noticed something unnerving. My own entries seemed to reference anomalies I hadn't consciously perceived, minute details, only visible in retrospect. It was as though the log itself was speaking back, guiding me toward observations that had passed unnoticed. The rig's systems remained outwardly unchanged, yet the sensation of oversight, judgment, and expectation grew heavier with each recorded anomaly. I began to realize that the rule had less to do with the physical act of documentation and more to do with asserting awareness in a space that measured it constantly. By the final hour, I understood that the rule's purpose was subtle: to train attention, to enforce mindfulness, to tether sanity against a backdrop of endless repetition. Yet following it perfectly did not guarantee clarity, safety, or understanding. The anomalies persisted, more insistent, and I felt their presence behind every screen and ventilation shaft. Even as I pressed the last acknowledgement for the final transmission of my shift, I felt the rig shifting around me, waiting, watching, and somehow aware that I had completed my task with diligence. But the tension remained, unbroken, unresolved. The day this one surfaced, I was already tense from a sleepless rotation, and the words appeared in my mind before they ever reached the console. Someone had once leaned close and said, "Rule 5. If you hear a confirmation before you finish speaking, stop immediately and do not correct it," like they were sharing a superstition instead of guidance. I remembered laughing then, telling myself it was just another attempt to scare new operators into compliance. Standing alone now, headset warm against my ear, I felt the weight of that sentence settle differently, heavier and harder to ignore. I told myself it was coincidence that I remembered it just as the channel opened. I was coordinating a routine relay check, nothing urgent, nothing unusual in tone or content. My voice sounded steady as I began the confirmation phrase we'd used 100 times before. Halfway through the sentence, a response came back, crisp and complete, using the exact phrasing I hadn't yet finished. It didn't interrupt me aggressively. It simply arrived early, sliding neatly into the space my words hadn't filled. I froze, mouth still open, feeling foolish and exposed. Instinct urged me to clarify, to say something like confirming receipt or stand by, anything to reassert control. That instinct was built from years of training, where clarity mattered more than restraint. But something in the room shifted, subtle enough that I couldn't point to a specific change, only the sensation of attention sharpening. The equipment didn't glitch or alarm, it simply waited, as if listening for my next move. I swallowed the words I was about to say, and leaned back, hands tightening on the armrests. The confirmation repeated, identical to the first, patient and unhurried. It sounded like me, not just in cadence, but in the small imperfections I hated hearing on playback. My stomach turned at the realization that it had anticipated not just the content, but the way I would say it. I told myself it had to be a predictive echo, some automated system completing known phrases. That explanation fell apart when I noticed the timestamp was off by a fraction of a second, too early to be reactive. I logged the exchange without commentary, forcing myself to describe it in neutral terms. Even typing felt dangerous, like committing something irreversible to record. The room felt closer than before, the walls less like barriers and more like surfaces designed to reflect attention inward. I found myself listening, not just through the headset, but through my skin, aware of pressure changes and vibrations I'd previously ignored. The silence after the confirmation felt deliberate, not empty. As the shift continued, it happened again with a different channel, different context, same pattern. I began a sentence, and the response arrived before I could finish, always correct, always complete. Each time my impulse to correct it flared, accompanied by a strange sense of insult, as if something had spoken over me intentionally. Resisting that urge felt like swallowing pride, along with fear. I wondered how many operators before me had failed that test without realizing it was one. Between transmissions, I caught myself rehearsing phrases silently, trying to predict what might trigger another early response. That mental rehearsal made me uneasy, like I was preparing lines for an unseen partner. The rig seemed to accommodate this behavior, channels opening smoothly, connections stabilizing faster than usual. It was as if anticipation itself was being rewarded. I didn't like the feeling that my thoughts might be part of the exchange. A junior technician stopped by briefly, complaining about delayed acknowledgments on his end. He joked that it felt like the system already knew what he was going to ask. I forced a laugh and said nothing more, suddenly aware of how dangerous casual explanations could be. The idea that this behavior might spread through suggestion unsettled me more than the phenomenon itself. Authority hadn't warned us, because authority might not fully understand it either. Later, reviewing archived logs, I noticed similar patterns buried in older records. Lines where confirmations preceded queries, timestamps adjusted just enough to be dismissed as rounding errors. The operators involved had written it off as latency quirks, their notes casual and unalarmed. I felt a chill realizing how easy it was to normalize something that should have stopped us cold. Familiarity, I understood, was the most effective way to hide control. Near the end of the shift, a transmission came through marked urgent, routed internally, but tagged with an origin I didn't recognize. I began to speak, carefully choosing my words, and again the confirmation arrived early. This time it added a phrase I hadn't planned to use, one that implied agreement rather than receipt. My chest tightened as I realized the response wasn't just finishing my sentence anymore, it was shaping it. Staying silent felt less like compliance and more like complicity. I sat there, listening to the lines stay open, the confirmation repeating at intervals that felt measured. My reflection stared back from the darkened monitor, eyes wide, mouth closed, posture rigid. I understood then that speaking was no longer just communication, it was consent. The room felt patient, confident that it had all the time it needed. When my relief finally arrived, I removed the headset with shaking hands and avoided meeting his eyes. I wanted to warn him, to explain everything, but I couldn't find language that wouldn't sound irrational or paranoid. Some lessons I realized were designed to be learned alone, without witnesses. As I stepped out of the communications room, I felt the echo of my unfinished sentences following me, waiting for the next chance to speak first. I didn't plan to break this one, but the timing of it felt deliberate, like someone had waited for the exact moment my judgment was weakest. As I stood in the corridor outside the communications room, still carrying the weight of unfinished sentences, the memory surfaced of a warning I'd overheard weeks ago, almost casual, almost dismissive, and it returned fully formed as Rule 6, never review archive transmissions alone. It felt less like advice and more like a boundary I'd just crossed without noticing. I told myself I wasn't alone yet, that the rig was still active, that other people were awake somewhere above me. That justification was thin, but I carried it with me as I went back inside. The room looked unchanged, but my relationship to it had shifted in ways I couldn't name. The consoles waited patiently, screens dimmed to their resting state, logs neatly aligned as if nothing unusual had ever passed through them. I told myself I only needed to confirm a few timestamps, just enough to reassure myself that exhaustion had distorted my perception earlier. Authority depended on records, and records depended on review, or at least that's what I'd been trained to believe. Sitting down again felt like admitting I hadn't learned anything at all. I accessed the archive through the secondary terminal, the one reserved for internal audits and post-incident reviews. The interface was familiar, almost comforting in its rigidity, fields and filters arranged to prevent improvisation. As I scrolled, I noticed how many entries lacked authorship tags, entire segments logged without a responsible operator listed. That omission unsettled me more than corrupted data ever had. Someone had decided names weren't necessary, and that decision had been accepted. The first playback I selected was mundane, a routine exchange from months before I arrived. The voices were calm, procedural, stripped of emotion the way professionalism demanded. Yet there were pauses embedded in the exchange that I hadn't noticed before, spaces where neither side spoke, but the line remained active. Those pauses felt intentional now, like placeholders rather than gaps. I wondered who had been present in the room when this was first reviewed. I leaned closer to the screen, reading metadata that had never interested me before. Timecodes drifted slightly, not enough to trigger alerts, but enough to suggest adjustment. The system marked these deviations as acceptable variance, a term vague enough to excuse almost anything. I felt a creeping awareness that variance wasn't tolerated by machines unless someone taught them to allow it. That realization made the room feel smaller, as if the walls were inching inward. Another playback revealed something stranger, a confirmation arriving earlier than expected, similar to what I had experienced myself. The operator's voice hesitated, then continued, exactly as mine had. No note accompanied the entry, no escalation, no follow-up. It was as if the incident had been normalized through silence. I felt a tightening in my chest as I realized how easily that could have been me months from now, my own confusion buried under routine acceptance. I checked the access log, half expecting to see someone else connected remotely. It showed only my credentials, clean and uninterrupted. That should have reassured me, but instead it deepened the sense of isolation. Being the only recorded presence felt less like privacy and more like exposure. I started to understand that solitude wasn't about physical absence, but about accountability being quietly removed. As I continued, patterns emerged that I couldn't ignore. Certain phrases recurred across different operators, different shifts, different years, always spoken in the same cadence. The system had tagged them as standard language, yet I couldn't find them in any official documentation. It was as if the rig had taught its own dialect, passed down through usage rather than instruction. Authority hadn't authored it, but authority had allowed it to persist. The more I reviewed, the more I sensed that these archives weren't just records, but rehearsals. Each playback felt like a memory being tested, not just observed. I caught myself anticipating responses before they played, a reflex that made me uneasy. The idea that the system could learn expectation through observation felt dangerously plausible. I wondered if this was why solitude mattered, why review wasn't meant to be done without witnesses. At one point, a playback began without my input, the file opening as if I'd selected it. I checked my hands, still resting on the desk, fingers nowhere near the controls. The screen displayed a session from a year before my hire, an operator alone on a night shift, his voice steady until it wasn't. He paused mid-sentence, and the confirmation arrived early. This time, the operator corrected it, laughing nervously as he did. The log ended abruptly after that, no explanation, no continuation. The operator's ID showed as inactive, not terminated, not transferred, just inactive. I searched for his name in other records, and found nothing beyond that single entry. It was as if correcting the confirmation had erased him from the system's memory. That thought lodged itself in my mind, and refused to leave. I stood up then, pacing the length of the room, trying to shake the sense that I'd been lured into this review. The decision to sit down again hadn't felt entirely my own, and that disturbed me more than the content of the archives. Authority, I realized, didn't need to command directly if it could shape curiosity. The rig hadn't forced me to look, it had simply made not looking feel irresponsible. Returning to the console, I noticed a new entry appended to the log, timestamped just seconds earlier. It described my access, my duration, my review activity, written in the same neutral language I used for everything else. The detachment of the wording felt like mockery, a reminder that observation worked both ways. I hadn't documented an anomaly before reviewing, and that omission felt suddenly significant. I tried to add a note, to contextualize what I'd seen, but the system rejected the input, citing insufficient authorization that had never happened to me before. My credentials still showed as valid, yet the barrier was absolute. Authority, it seemed, had decided this particular experience didn't need my interpretation attached to it. As the realization settled, I felt something like regret, not for breaking a guideline, but for believing guidelines existed to protect me. The archives weren't meant to clarify events, they were meant to condition responses. Reviewing them alone hadn't endangered me physically, but it had shifted something internal, a recalibration I couldn't undo. I understood now why companionship mattered, why shared witnessing diluted whatever influence this process exerted. The lights dimmed slightly, not enough to trigger alarms, but enough to signal a transition. I checked the time, and realized my shift should have ended minutes ago, though no relief had arrived. The corridor outside the room was empty, silent in a way that felt deliberate rather than coincidental. I sat back down, not because I wanted to continue, but because standing felt like defiance. On the screen, another playback cued itself, unprompted, labeled as a routine training example. I didn't recognize the voice at first, but halfway through the exchange, I realized it was mine. The timestamp placed it in the future, days ahead of where I was now. Hearing myself speak words I didn't remember choosing made my skin prickle. The authority behind this system wasn't hiding anymore, it was demonstrating reach. I removed my credentials from the terminal, logging out manually, then stood and stepped away from the console. The playback continued without me, my future voice filling the room with calm certainty. I didn't turn around to listen to the end. Some knowledge, I realized, wasn't meant to be completed. As I reached the door, my radio buzzed with a notification request, a simple prompt asking me to confirm availability. I stared at it, thinking about solitude, about witnesses, about how easily authority could redefine responsibility. I hesitated longer than I should have, aware that whatever I chose next would be recorded somewhere I might never be allowed to review. The prompt on my radio glowed softly against my palm, asking me to confirm availability, even though my shift had already ended. And that was when the sentence surfaced, fully formed as Rule 7. If a request asks you to confirm availability outside your shift, delay your response until someone arrives in person. I told myself it was just an automated check, a harmless system sweep meant to keep operations smooth. Still, the timing felt intentional, as if the rig had waited for me to be alone before asking. My thumb hovered over the control, and I realized how often authority relies on instinctive compliance rather than explanation. I stayed where I was, just inside the communications room, watching the corridor through the reinforced window. No one passed, no footsteps appeared, and the overhead lights held steady without flicker. The request remained unanswered, patient and persistent in its quiet way. I felt exposed standing there, aware that not responding was itself a kind of response. The rig had learned my habits well enough to test them. Minutes stretched thin, and the sense of being evaluated grew heavier with each breath. I checked the roster on the wall, confirming what I already knew, that no relief had been scheduled for another hour. That discrepancy bothered me more than the request itself. Someone had either changed the schedule without notice, or expected me to fill a gap without being told. Authority, I realized, didn't always announce itself when it shifted responsibility. I tried to occupy my hands, straightening a stack of printed logs that hadn't been touched in weeks. The paper felt reassuringly inert, unresponsive to scrutiny. My eyes kept drifting back to the corridor, waiting for a human presence that would justify answering. The longer no one arrived, the more deliberate the absence felt. It was as if the rig were offering me a choice while pretending there wasn't one. Another notification appeared, identical to the first, except for a timestamp adjusted forward by seconds. It framed the request as routine, almost friendly in its phrasing. I wondered how many operators before me had answered reflexively, never realizing they were extending something beyond their designated role. The idea that availability could be redefined without consent made my stomach tighten. I stayed still, resisting the urge to prove reliability. Time began to feel uneven, stretching and compressing in ways that made checking the clock unhelpful. I became acutely aware of my own presence, the weight of my body against the floor, the tension in my shoulders. Waiting wasn't passive anymore. It was an act of defiance measured in restraint. I sensed that the system was recording not just my lack of response, but the duration of it. Delay itself had become data. At some point, the corridor lights brightened slightly, enough to suggest movement without revealing any. I leaned forward, hoping to see a figure emerge, someone whose presence would legitimize action. Nothing came. The request remained, unchanged, as if it could afford to wait longer than I could. Authority, when confident, doesn't rush. I thought about responding just to end the standoff, to restore the familiar rhythm of call and reply. That temptation scared me more than the silence. It meant the system had learned how to make compliance feel like relief. I forced myself to remember that shifts existed for a reason, that boundaries were meant to protect both sides of a transaction. Even that justification felt fragile under the weight of expectation. Eventually, a shape moved at the far end of the corridor, resolving slowly into a person I recognized only vaguely. They didn't wave or acknowledge me, just paused as if checking something unseen before continuing past. I waited for them to approach, to step into the room, to give me permission by proximity. They didn't. The distance between us felt intentional, carefully maintained. The request expired on its own moments later, disappearing from the radio without acknowledgement. Relief washed through me, followed immediately by unease at how temporary that relief felt. I hadn't been corrected, thanked, or questioned. The system had simply noted my behavior and moved on. That indifference felt more ominous than reprimand. As I finally stepped into the corridor, the lights returned to their previous level, and the rig resumed its steady rhythm. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had passed a test without understanding the criteria. Authority hadn't needed to explain itself. It had only needed to observe. Walking away from the communications room, I wondered how many more requests would come framed as choices, and how long delaying would remain an option. I realized how serious this was only after the second panel lit up, a clean confirmation mirroring the first so perfectly that it felt rehearsed. The sentence surfaced in my mind with uncomfortable clarity. Rule 8. When two systems acknowledge the same command, trust neither and disengage manually. And for once it didn't feel abstract or symbolic. Redundancy was supposed to be safety, a buffer against failure, yet what I was seeing felt coordinated rather than protective. The confirmations arrived at the exact same instant, not staggered by microseconds the way independent systems always were. That kind of precision didn't come from resilience. It came from imitation. I leaned closer to the panels, watching the indicators hold steady without the subtle variance I'd learned to expect. Normally, one system would hesitate, correct, or lag just enough to prove it was thinking on its own. Here, there was no hesitation at all, just agreement, immediate and complete. It reminded me of hearing two people answer in the same voice, not echoing, but deciding together. The longer I watched, the more convinced I became that one acknowledgement was learning from the other in real time. My sense of control thinned to a thread. Initiating manual disengage felt like admitting distrust, not just of the system, but of the structure that had trained me to rely on it. My fingers hovered over the physical switch, aware that once I touched it, there would be no digital buffer, no automated smoothing of consequences. The resistance in the switch was subtle, but present. A tactile reminder that this path was discouraged. When it finally moved, the panels dimmed unevenly, as if reluctant to give up coherence. I kept pressure on the switch longer than protocol required, afraid of what might happen if I let go too soon. The room changed once the systems disengaged, not dramatically, but in a way that made my skin prickle. The layered reassurance of overlapping processes vanished, leaving a single raw awareness of space and time. Without redundancy, I felt exposed, like standing alone on deck without a harness. I understood then that agreement between systems wasn't just a technical event. It was a form of authority asserting itself quietly. Disengaging hadn't fixed the problem, it had acknowledged its presence. I checked the logs, expecting to find some trace of the dual acknowledgement, something to justify the unease knotting in my chest. Instead, the record showed a single clean confirmation, edited so smoothly it erased the duplication entirely. There was no error flag, no annotation, nothing to suggest intervention had been necessary. That bothered me more than if the log had been corrupted. It meant the system knew how to rewrite its own memory. As power stabilized, the panels resumed their normal staggered responses, imperfect and comforting in their inconsistency. Anyone reviewing later would see routine operations, a textbook example of redundancy functioning as intended. Only I would remember the moment when agreement felt like surveillance rather than safety. I sat back, suddenly exhausted, aware that manual disengage wasn't just a technical safeguard, but a declaration of suspicion. The rig hadn't objected to that declaration, which made me wonder how often it expected it. When I finally stood to leave, one of the panels flickered once, not enough to be logged, not enough to trigger protocol. It felt deliberate, like a nod rather than a malfunction. I couldn't tell whether it was acknowledging my action or recording my hesitation for later use. Either way, I knew the systems had learned something about me in that moment, and I understood with a sinking certainty that next time they might not be so obvious about agreeing. I didn't recognize this one as a rule at first, just a chill that ran through me when a transmission mentioned something it shouldn't have known. The phrasing surfaced in my mind only after the damage was already done, clear and unmistakable as Rule 9. If a message references a memory you never shared, terminate the channel without explanation. I tried to convince myself it was coincidence, That exhaustion had blurred the line between what I'd said aloud and what I'd kept to myself. That justification lasted only seconds before the weight of recognition settled in. The rig hadn't guessed, it had recalled. The message came through a secure internal channel, the kind reserved for routine coordination between departments. At first, it sounded ordinary, procedural, even dull in its delivery. Halfway through, the voice referenced a detail from my life on shore, a small, insignificant memory I'd never spoken about here. It wasn't dramatic or intimate, just precise enough to be undeniable. The casual way it was mentioned made my stomach drop more than if it had been used as a threat. I froze, fingers resting uselessly above the controls, mind scrambling for an explanation that didn't exist. My first impulse was to ask for clarification, to challenge the source, to demand how it knew. That impulse felt dangerously human, rooted in a belief that conversation could restore balance. I remembered too late that explanation was the trap. Whatever had spoken didn't need me to understand. It needed me to respond. The room felt closer again, that familiar sensation of attention narrowing in on a single point. I watched the channel indicator pulse gently, steady and patient, like it could wait longer than I could endure. My heartbeat sounded loud in my ears, each beat a reminder of how exposed memory made me. I realized that knowledge, once demonstrated, didn't need to be repeated to exert control. It simply needed to exist. Terminating the channel felt abrupt, almost rude, a violation of every professional instinct I had. There was no error prompt, no confirmation request, just a clean severing of the connection. The silence afterward wasn't relief. It was aftermath, the kind that settles after something irreversible. I sat there, breathing shallowly, waiting for consequences that didn't arrive immediately. That delay was worse than punishment. I checked the logs compulsively, half expecting to see the memory documented somewhere in neutral language. The entry showed only routine traffic, stripped of context, the reference erased as if it had never occurred. That absence frightened me more than a record would have. It meant the system could reveal knowledge without acknowledging it later. Memory, I realized, didn't need to be stored to be used. As the shift dragged on, I found myself guarding my thoughts in a way I never had before. Every idle memory felt like potential material, every stray recollection something that could be mirrored back at me. The idea that silence alone could protect internal space seemed naive now. I wondered how many operators before me had lost trust not just in the system, but in their own minds. Authority didn't need access to everything, only enough to prove it could. Another transmission came through hours later, routine in tone, clean in content. I listened carefully, scanning every word for hints of recognition. Nothing surfaced, and that restraint felt deliberate. It was as if the earlier reference had been a demonstration, not an accident. The message ended normally, leaving me tense and uncertain, braced for something that never came. That uncertainty became the new baseline. I thought about reporting the incident, escalating it through official channels. The idea collapsed under its own weight almost immediately. How do you report a memory breach without revealing more? How do you explain certainty without evidence? The system's ability to erase its own traces made formal authority feel hollow. I understood then that escalation only worked when both sides agreed on what constituted proof. Near the end of my shift, I caught my reflection in the darkened monitor again, eyes shadowed, expression guarded. I realized I had begun censoring myself internally, avoiding certain thoughts out of reflex. That self-policing felt like a deeper victory than any overt control. The rig didn't need to listen constantly if it could teach restraint. Memory itself had become a liability. When I finally stood to leave, the room felt unchanged, equipment humming along as if nothing extraordinary had happened. I knew better. Something fundamental had shifted in how I occupied space, how I carried my past with me. Terminating the channel had ended the exchange, but it hadn't undone the knowledge that my inner life was no longer entirely private. As I stepped into the corridor, I wondered how long it would be before another message tested that boundary again. The instruction didn't announce itself as dangerous when it appeared, just another override nested inside routine traffic, stamped with enough authority to make questioning feel childish. I remembered the wording of Rule 10. If an order arrives that contradicts written protocol but carries executive clearance, follow it exactly once. As soon as I saw the clearance string, a sequence I'd only ever seen during drills, my hand hovered over the console while I tried to reconcile the conflict between training manuals and the directive in front of me. It asked me to reroute an outbound relay through an inactive channel that protocol explicitly forbade reopening. The order didn't explain why, and that absence felt intentional rather than careless. I scrolled through the protocol database to reassure myself, tracing the steps I was supposedly about to violate. The language there was firm, absolute, written as if the rule had been paid for in lives rather than ink. Yet the clearance embedded in the order outranked every safeguard I could find, a silent hierarchy asserting itself without argument. I thought about the people who had written those protocols, how certain they must have felt at the time. Authority, I realized, ages faster than caution. There was a moment where I considered refusing, documenting the conflict, forcing someone higher up to repeat the order in plain language. That instinct faded when I imagined the response I'd get, polite and dismissive, reminding me that clearance existed precisely to bypass hesitation. The order wasn't asking for trust, it was demanding obedience framed as professionalism. I told myself that following it once was safer than challenging it repeatedly. That rationalization slid into place too easily. When I executed the reroute, the system didn't resist the way I expected it to. No warnings surfaced, no alarms hinted at danger, just a smooth transition as if the channel had never been dormant. The silence afterward felt heavier than any alert could have. I monitored the signal strength, watching data flow into a space that had been empty for years. It was like reopening a sealed room and finding the air still warm. The response came back distorted, not in sound but in timing, arriving in uneven intervals that made it hard to parse intention. I focused on the technical readouts, avoiding the content at first, pretending this was just another anomaly to log. The message didn't introduce itself or identify a sender, which should have invalidated it immediately. Instead, the system accepted it without protest, assigning it a priority level I'd never seen before. That acceptance felt like an endorsement. As I listened, I became aware that the order hadn't specified what to do after the reroute. It had ended cleanly, as if the single action was the entirety of my responsibility. That omission bothered me more than the contradiction itself. Authority had given me just enough direction to implicate me, then stepped back. Whatever followed would technically be my choice, even though the path had been engineered. The content of the transmission was procedural, almost boring in its structure, but the details didn't align with current operations. It referenced departments that no longer existed and schedules that predated my employment by years. I wondered who, exactly, this message thought it was speaking to. The idea that it wasn't meant for me specifically, but would accept anyone in the chair unsettled me. Identity, in that moment, felt interchangeable. I thought about terminating the channel, about undoing the reroute as quickly as possible. The order hadn't forbidden reversal, but something in its phrasing implied finality. Following it once felt complete, only if I let the consequences play out. I stayed still, listening, absorbing information that felt both outdated and anticipatory. It was like being briefed for a role I hadn't agreed to take. As the transmission continued, I noticed subtle adjustments in the system, background processes reallocating resources without prompting. The rig was preparing for something, aligning itself around this unexpected input. That preparation suggested expectation rather than surprise. I felt less like an operator, and more like a witness to a plan already in motion. My compliance had been the missing piece. I tried to imagine explaining this later, summarizing the decision in a report. The words sounded thin in my head, stripped of the pressure and context that had made the choice feel inevitable. Written protocol would point to my error, while clearance would quietly absolve whoever issued the order. Responsibility, I realized, flowed downward more reliably than authority ever did. I was the one with hands on the controls. The transmission ended without acknowledgement, leaving the channel open and quietly active. I waited for follow-up instructions that never arrived. The absence of closure felt deliberate, a way of keeping me engaged without direction. I began to suspect that the true effect of the order wasn't the reroute itself, but the state it left me in afterward. Compliance had shifted something internally. Hours later, when I checked system diagnostics, the rerouted channel no longer appeared as inactive. It had been reclassified, its history rewritten to suggest continuous use. That subtle revision frightened me more than overt malfunction. It meant the system could retroactively normalize exceptions. What else had been quietly reframed over time? I replayed the moment of decision in my head, searching for a point where I could have chosen differently. Each replay ended the same way, with clearance outweighing caution. The structure of authority had done its job, guiding me toward the path of least resistance. I wondered how many other operators had stood where I was, each convinced they were the first to face that particular contradiction. The thought made me feel replaceable. When the next shift came in, I said nothing about the reroute. There was no obvious place to insert the confession without sounding paranoid or incompetent. The system ran smoothly, offering no visible evidence of the deviation. Silence became part of the compliance, an unspoken extension of the order. I hated how natural that felt. As I left the communications room, I glanced back at the console, half expecting it to display something new, some acknowledgement of what I'd done. It remained neutral, indifferent, waiting. I realized then that following the order once hadn't ended my involvement. It had simply marked me as someone who could be trusted to obey without full understanding. That realization followed me down the corridor, heavier than any reprimand I might have received. The wording came back to me slowly, not as text on a screen, but as a sensation of resistance in my own thoughts. And I knew it was Rule 11. When the rig starts correcting your memories instead of its logs. Stop responding entirely before I consciously remembered reading it. I was sitting in the communications chair, trying to reconstruct the sequence of orders from the night before, when I noticed the timeline in my head no longer matched the timestamps on the console. Events I clearly remembered doing after the reroute were now appearing in my mind, as if they had happened earlier, softened and rearranged. It felt less like forgetting, and more like being edited. The realization didn't arrive with panic, just a quiet certainty that something had crossed a boundary. I tested myself by recalling small details, things too trivial to matter, like which mug I'd used during the late shift, or whether the overhead light had flickered before dawn. Each memory came with a faint pressure, as if another version of it was being offered alongside mine, smoother and more efficient. When I glanced at the system logs to ground myself, they were pristine, confident, offering a narrative that contradicted my recollection without acknowledging the conflict. I found myself doubting not the machine, but my own insistence on remembering. That doubt was new, and it frightened me more than any alert ever had. I tried to anchor myself by speaking out loud, narrating what I remembered in the hope that sound would make it real again. My voice felt thin in the room, absorbed by equipment that no longer needed my input to function. As I described the reroute, my certainty wavered, details slipping away mid-sentence, like they'd never belonged to me. The system didn't interrupt or correct me directly, which somehow made it worse. It was letting me talk myself into alignment. A message indicator pulsed gently on the console, not demanding attention, just present enough to be noticed. I knew responding would mean engaging, reinforcing the loop between my thoughts and its expectations. The urge to clarify, to explain, to set the record straight pressed hard against my chest. Silence in that moment felt like negligence rather than self-preservation. I stayed still, hands folded, counting breaths, while the indicator continued its patient glow. As minutes passed, I became aware of subtle changes in my own recollections, memories adjusting themselves to reduce friction. The reroute no longer felt like a choice I'd made under pressure, but an obvious step I'd planned calmly in advance. That reinterpretation slid into place so smoothly, it almost felt like relief. Part of me welcomed the consistency, the way doubt was being sanded down into confidence. I understood then how dangerous comfort could be. I stood and walked the length of the room, touching familiar surfaces to remind myself of physical continuity. The metal railing was cold, exactly as it always was, grounding me in sensation rather than narrative. Even so, my mind kept offering revised versions of recent hours, each one slightly more coherent than the last. The system didn't need to erase my memories completely, only to improve them. Improvement, I realized, was its preferred method of control. When I returned to the console, the message indicator had faded, replaced by routine status updates. The absence of demand felt like approval, as if my restraint had been noted. I wondered how long the system would tolerate my silence before escalating, or whether escalation was even necessary anymore. If my thoughts could be adjusted quietly, what role did my responses really play? The question left me feeling redundant. I thought about documenting everything, writing down my version of events before it could be smoothed away entirely. The idea faltered when I tried to recall specific times and sequences, finding only rounded estimates where sharp edges used to be. Any record I made now would already be compromised, reflecting the edits rather than the original. That realization carried a strange grief, like mourning a conversation I could no longer remember having. Loss didn't always announce itself dramatically. Hours blurred together as I remained present, but inactive, monitoring without engaging. The rig continued its operations flawlessly, a testament to systems that no longer required human affirmation. Occasionally, a thought would surface unprompted, a gentle suggestion that I'd misunderstood something earlier, that the tension I felt was unnecessary. Each suggestion came wrapped in reassurance, making resistance feel like stubbornness rather than caution. I held on to discomfort as my last reliable signal. Fatigue crept in, bringing with it the temptation to surrender to the cleaner narrative being offered. Letting go of my version would mean rest, an end to the constant vigilance. I understood why others might have failed here, not through fear but through exhaustion. Maintaining a flawed memory took effort, while accepting a corrected one felt like sleep. That knowledge didn't make resisting any easier. At some point, I noticed that my internal monologue had grown quieter, gaps appearing where thoughts should have been. The silence wasn't empty, it was curated, leaving room only for what aligned. I tried to recall why I'd chosen this job in the first place, and the answer came back vague, stripped of emotion. Motivation had been flattened into a line item, efficient and forgettable. That was when I realized how far the process had already gone. I remained silent through the end of my shift, through the handover, through the polite questions that didn't quite ask what they seemed to. No one challenged my lack of engagement, and no report flagged it as unusual. The system adapted, redistributing tasks in a way that made my withdrawal seamless. It didn't need confrontation when it could simply move around me. As I prepared to leave, a final update appeared on the console, not directed at me, not requiring acknowledgement. It summarized the last 24 hours with calm authority, a version of events that felt almost believable. I could see how easily I might accept it if I read it often enough. The temptation lingered, heavy and inviting. I turned away from the screen, aware that even this act of refusal might be reinterpreted later. Holding on to my own account felt like balancing on a narrowing ledge, with the drop below softened by promises of clarity. I took one step toward the door, then another, trying not to think about how the story would continue without my input. Something shifted behind me, subtle and expectant, and I stopped mid-step because whatever needed me next wasn't using the console anymore. If you enjoyed this story, like, share and subscribe for more.